On June 12, 2014, at exactly 6:07 p.m., my stepfather tossed a crisp $100 bill across the kitchen counter and told me I had 15 minutes to leave the house forever. There were 9 people sitting at that table when he did it, and not one of them said a single word. If you've ever had a moment where your entire life split into before and after, you already know what that kind of silence feels like. Before I go on, take a second to like and subscribe if stories about betrayal, survival, and quiet revenge resonate with you. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always read them, and it reminds me how many of us have survived things we never talk about. My name is Lauren Whitmore. I'm 31 now, but I was 19 the night I learned that being raised in a house doesn't mean you ever belonged in it. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and overcooked roast beef that evening. My stepfather, Richard Whitmore, had just come home from work, still wearing his Navy insurance company polo, and the silver watch he checked every 5 minutes, like time owed him money. He didn't shout when he threw the bill. He didn't curse. He just slid it off the counter with 2 fingers, like he was brushing crumbs onto the floor. "Take it," he said calmly. "You've cost me enough already." My younger half-brother Evan was at the table, frozen mid-bite, a forkful of mashed potatoes hovering in the air. My Aunt Deborah stared down at her wine glass. My grandmother shifted in her chair, but didn't speak. Nobody ever spoke when Richard decided something. That was the rule of the house. 15 minutes, he repeated, checking his watch again. I remember noticing the exact details in that moment, because shock has a strange way of sharpening your senses. The hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the faint scrape of Evan's sneaker tapping against the table leg, and the number printed on that bill. That was the price he put on me. I picked it up slowly, folded it once, then twice, and slipped it into my back pocket. Not because I needed it, because I wanted to remember it. I walked upstairs without saying a word, and I didn't cry. Not then. You'd think that moment was the worst part. It wasn't. The worst part was realizing it had been coming my entire life. My mother, Teresa Collins, had been the only reason that house ever felt warm. She had a way of softening Richard's sharp edges without ever confronting him directly. She could redirect conversations with a laugh, calm his temper with a touch on his arm, and somehow make me feel protected without making it obvious. She died when I was 11, breast cancer. The doctors gave her 9 months. She lasted 18. After she was gone, Richard didn't change overnight. He simply stopped pretending. Before her illness, he'd treated me like a polite obligation. Never cruel, just distant, like a landlord acknowledging a tenant. After her funeral, I became something else entirely. A reminder. I didn't understand that at the time. I just knew things shifted in small, quiet ways. Evan got a brand new laptop for middle school. I used a second-hand one from the public library's surplus sale. Evan's bedroom got repainted when he turned 13. Mine stayed the same faded pale yellow my mother had chosen years earlier, the color of a memory nobody wanted to update. When relatives visited, Richard introduced Evan proudly. "This is my boy." When it came to me, he'd say my name without context, like I was an afterthought. "This is Lauren." Never my daughter. Not once. For years, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Kids do that. We rewrite reality to make it less painful. But then, there were the comments he thought I didn't hear. Like the night I was 13, sitting halfway down the stairs, while he talked on the phone in the kitchen. "I don't care what Teresa believed," he said quietly. "That girl isn't mine." I remember gripping the banister so hard, my fingers went numb. At 13, you don't fully understand adult accusations, but you understand rejection and tone. His voice sounded final, certain, like he'd already closed a case. After that night, the gap between Evan and me widened into something unbridgeable. He went to private summer camps. I worked part-time at a grocery store, starting at 15. He had birthday parties with friends and catered pizza. I baked my own cakes from boxed mix after late shifts. The older I got, the more invisible I became, until the night I turned 19. That evening, I hadn't expected anything special. I just wanted to eat dinner quietly and maybe call my best friend afterward. I never imagined I'd be packing my life into a laundry basket, while a man who raised me watched from the doorway like he was supervising a move-out inspection. "Time's up," Richard said when I came downstairs. I stood in the entryway, holding the basket, my heart beating so loudly it felt like it might shake the walls. Evan stood at the base of the stairs, eyes red, jaw clenched. "Dad," he started. Richard didn't even look at him. "This doesn't concern you." And that was the moment I realized something that took me years to fully understand. Cruelty doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks calm, controlled, certain. I walked out the front door at exactly 6:23 p.m. I remember the exact time because the porch light flickered on as the sun dropped behind the trees, and I glanced back at the clock through the living room window. Richard had already turned away. He didn't watch me leave. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, unsure where to go. Then I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I pulled my phone out and called the one person who had never once made me feel like I didn't belong. My mother's older sister, Margaret Collins. She answered on the second ring, and when I said he threw me out, she didn't ask a single question. She just said 4 words: "I'm on my way." I thought that night was the end of my story with Richard Whitmore. I was wrong, because what I didn't know then, what no one in that house knew, was that 10 years later, I would walk back into his life, holding something that could destroy everything he believed about the past. And when that moment finally came, it wouldn't happen in private. It would happen in front of more than 100 witnesses, and he wouldn't be able to walk away this time. At 6:52 p.m. that same night, my Aunt Margaret's silver Honda pulled up to the curb with its hazard lights blinking, and she stepped out without even turning off the engine. She was still wearing her hospital scrubs, pale blue, with a coffee stain near the pocket, her gray, streaked hair tied back in a loose knot. She looked like someone who had left work in the middle of a shift, which, as I later learned, she had. The first thing she did wasn't ask questions. She just wrapped her arms around me. And for the first time since my mother died, I felt safe. "Get in," she said softly. "We'll talk later." I slid into the passenger seat, clutching the laundry basket on my lap like it was the only solid thing left in my life. As we pulled away from the house on Willow Creek Drive, I looked back once. The porch light glowed warm and steady. From the outside, it still looked like a home. Inside, it had never really been one. Margaret lived 20 minutes away, in a small ranch house on the edge of Franklin, Ohio, a quiet town where most people worked, either at the hospital or the paper mill. Her place smelled like lavender and old books, and the living room was lined with framed photos of family going back decades. My mother appeared in many of them, laughing at a picnic table, holding me as a baby, standing beside Margaret at a county fair. Their heads leaned together like conspirators. Margaret set my basket down near the couch and went straight to the kitchen. "Have you eaten?" she called. I realized then that I hadn't. Not since lunch at my campus cafeteria, hours earlier. "No," I said quietly. She made me a grilled cheese sandwich and a bowl of tomato soup, the kind that comes from a can, but somehow tastes better when someone else prepares it for you. We sat at the small wooden kitchen table while the ceiling fan hummed above us. She didn't ask what happened until I finished eating. Then she folded her hands and looked at me steadily. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the dinner table, the $100 bill, the 15-minute ultimatum, the years of small, cold dismissals that led up to that moment. She listened without interrupting, her face tightening in ways that told me none of this surprised her as much as I'd expected. When I finished, she let out a long breath. "He's been saying it for years," she said quietly. My chest tightened. "Saying what? That you weren't his." The words landed like something heavy dropped into still water. "You knew," I whispered. She hesitated. "I suspected." The room went very still. "You suspected," I repeated slowly, "and you never told me." Margaret's eyes filled with something that looked a lot like regret. "Your mother made me promise," she said. I stared at her. "Promise what?" "That if Richard ever started saying those things out loud, I would let her handle it," Margaret said. She believed she could fix it. A hollow feeling spread through my chest. "Fix what?" Margaret looked down at her hands for a long moment before answering. "Your father's insecurity." The word father felt strange, almost foreign. "Richard's not my father," I asked quietly. Margaret's head snapped up. "No," she said firmly. "He is." I blinked. "Then why?" "Because Richard needed to believe otherwise," she said. I didn't understand. "Not yet." Margaret stood up and went to the hallway, returning a moment later with a small wooden box. It was old, worn at the edges, the kind of thing people use to store letters or keepsakes. She set it on the table between us. "This belonged to your mother," she said softly. My throat tightened. Inside the box were photographs, folded papers, and a small envelope sealed with yellowed tape. Margaret touched the envelope, but didn't open it. "She asked me to keep this until you were older," she said. "How much older?" I whispered. She met my eyes. "Until you could handle the truth." A cold, uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. "What truth?" Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she said something that would haunt me for years. "Your mother never betrayed Richard," she said slowly. "But he betrayed her first." The air seemed to leave the room. "What do you mean?" Margaret exhaled. "When your mother was pregnant with you, she discovered Richard had been seeing someone else." My heart started pounding. She confronted him. Margaret continued. "He denied it, swore he'd never done anything wrong." I swallowed hard. "But he had," she said quietly. The ceiling fan hummed overhead, the steady sound suddenly unbearably loud. "So he decided," Margaret went on, "that if he could convince himself you weren't his, he wouldn't have to face what he did." I stared at her, unable to speak. "That's why he treated you differently," she said. "You were proof of the timeline he didn't want to accept." My hands trembled on the table. "So all these years," I whispered, "he knew." Margaret's voice broke slightly. "Yes." Silence filled the room, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels heavy, crushing. I looked at the sealed envelope in the wooden box. "What's in there?" I asked. Margaret hesitated again. "Something your mother wanted you to have," she said. "But not yet." Not yet. Those two words would echo in my mind for the next decade. Because I didn't open that envelope that night. I didn't open it the next year, or the year after that. Instead, I tucked it into a drawer in Margaret's guest room, where I slept for the next 3 years, while I finished college, worked 2 jobs, and slowly built a life that had nothing to do with Richard Whitmore. But even as I moved forward, something stayed unfinished. A question, a story that had never been fully told. And I didn't realize how important that sealed envelope would become until 11 years later, when a lawyer called me about Richard's retirement gala and told me there would be more than 100 people in that room, including him, and he had no idea what I was planning to bring with me. On September 3rd, 2025, at exactly 9:12 a.m., my phone rang while I was reviewing a $2.4 million commercial zoning proposal in my office in downtown Columbus. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number from Franklin County Legal Services. I almost didn't answer. If I had let it go to voicemail, everything that happened afterward might have unfolded very differently. But I picked up on the 3rd ring. "Lauren Whitmore," a calm female voice asked. "Yes, this is Patricia Klein, estate attorney for Richard Whitmore." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I hadn't heard his name spoken directly to me in over 11 years. The silence on my end stretched long enough that she continued. I'm calling because your stepfather has formally requested your presence at a public event next month. It concerns an announcement involving his business succession. My stomach tightened. I don't have anything to do with him, I said carefully. Yes, she replied, her tone neutral. That is precisely why he requested this be delivered through legal channels. That sentence sent a chill down my spine. Why would he want me there, I asked. There was a brief pause before she answered. Because she said he plans to make a formal declaration about family legacy and inheritance. I felt the air in my office shift. What kind of declaration? Her voice lowered slightly. He intends to publicly state that you are not legally or biologically his child. The words hit with the same cold precision as the night he threw that $100 bill. For a moment, the room felt like it tilted. I see, I said quietly. He is hosting a retirement gala, Patricia continued. October 11th, the Franklin Civic Center Ballroom. Approximately 140 guests are expected business partners, extended family community leaders. I stared at the glass wall of my office, watching employees move in the hallway outside. He specifically asked that you be present, she added. Why, I asked again. Another pause. Then she said something that made my pulse spike. He intends to finalize a legal transfer of his company shares and personal assets exclusively to his son, Evan Whitmore, during the event. So that was it. He wanted witnesses, a public stage, an audience. He wanted to erase me officially, the same way he had been trying to erase me emotionally for decades. Miss Whitmore, the attorney said gently, I am legally obligated to inform you that if you wish to contest any statements regarding inheritance rights, this would be your opportunity to do so. I almost laughed. Inheritance. That word meant nothing to me. I don't want anything from him, I said. I understand, she replied. But there is something else you should know. My heart thudded. What? Your mother left documentation, Patricia said. Documents that have recently come into legal relevance. My fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of documentation? They were filed with a notary 12 years ago, she said. Sealed under instructions that they be released if Richard Whitmore attempted to publicly deny paternity. Every nerve in my body went still, because suddenly I knew exactly what she was talking about. The envelope, the one sitting in a drawer at my Aunt Margaret's house for more than a decade. You're referring, I said slowly, to something my aunt has. Yes, Patricia confirmed. We have a notarized record indicating Margaret Collins is the designated holder. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Miss Whitmore, she said gently, I cannot advise you on personal decisions, but if you plan to attend the gala, I strongly recommend reviewing those documents beforehand. The call ended a minute later, but I sat at my desk for a long time afterward, staring at nothing, because something inside me had just shifted. For 11 years, I had avoided opening that envelope, not because I wasn't curious, because I was afraid of what it might confirm, afraid of reopening wounds I had spent years trying to close. But now, Richard wasn't content to leave the past buried. He wanted to rewrite it publicly. Again. And this time, he wanted an audience. That afternoon, I left work early and drove straight to Franklin. Margaret's house hadn't changed much over the years. The same white siding, the same maple tree in the front yard, now taller and casting deeper shade. She answered the door before I even knocked. I had a feeling you'd come today, she said quietly. I stepped inside. How did you know? She gave a sad smile. Because Patricia Klein called me this morning, too. Of course she had. We sat at the same kitchen table, where she had first told me the truth years earlier. The wooden box was already there, waiting. Margaret rested her hand on it. He's going through with it, isn't he? She asked softly. Yes, I said. Her eyes closed briefly. He always needed to control the narrative, she whispered. I nodded. He plans to announce publicly that I was never his, I said. Margaret's jaw tightened. Then it's time, she said. She slid the box toward me. For a moment, I couldn't move, because opening that envelope meant stepping back into a past I had worked very hard to leave behind. Are you sure? I asked quietly. Margaret met my eyes. You deserve the truth, she said, and your mother deserves to be defended. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the envelope. The tape was brittle with age. It peeled away with a faint, tearing sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet kitchen. Inside were 3 folded documents. The first was a typed letter signed by my mother. The second was a notarized statement. The third made my breath stop completely, because it wasn't a letter. It was a lab report. And at the top, in bold letters, were 3 words that changed everything. DNA paternity test, dated March 17th, 1994. My birth year. My hands started shaking, because I hadn't known this existed, not even once. And as I unfolded the paper, my eyes landed on the single line that Richard Whitmore had spent 3 decades trying to deny. Probability of paternity, 99.997%. Richard Allen Whitmore is the biological father of Lauren Whitmore. The room felt like it went silent and loud at the same time. Margaret watched me carefully. I didn't tell you, she said softly, because your mother didn't want you growing up fighting his lies. I couldn't speak, because suddenly, the entire story of my life looked different. Richard hadn't treated me like an outsider because he doubted. He had treated me that way because he knew. And I wasn't just proof of his marriage. I was proof of his betrayal. I looked down at the remaining document. What's this? I whispered. Margaret's voice dropped. That, she said, is the part he's most afraid of. I unfolded it slowly, and as my eyes moved across the first lines, a cold, steady clarity settled over me. Because it wasn't just evidence. It was a timeline. Names, dates, financial records. Proof that during my mother's pregnancy, Richard had secretly transferred more than $180,000 to another woman. A woman whose name I had never heard before until that moment. And when I read it out loud, Margaret's face went pale. Lauren, she whispered. That woman, I said slowly, is still alive. And suddenly, I understood exactly why Richard was so desperate to bury the truth. Because if this information came out publicly, he wouldn't just lose his reputation. He could lose everything he built over the past 30 years. At 2:18 p.m. that same afternoon, I sat at my Aunt Margaret's kitchen table, staring at the name printed at the top of the financial records. Caroline Bishop. The letters looked ordinary, almost harmless, but they carried the weight of 30 years of lies. Next to the name were bank transfer confirmations, account numbers, and a ledger showing payments that began in October 1993, 3 months before I was born. Weekly transfers, then monthly, then larger lump sums. The total at the bottom was circled in red ink by my mother's handwriting. $183,400. Adjusted for inflation today, it would be worth more than $350,000. My chest tightened, because that number told a story, a very clear one. While my mother was pregnant, while she was working overtime as a school counselor, while she was trying to keep her marriage together, Richard had been financially supporting another woman in secret. For years, Margaret watched me carefully. She found out 6 months before you were born, she said quietly. I looked up. How? Margaret hesitated. Bank statements, she said. Richard was careless 1 month, left them in the kitchen. I could picture it instantly. My mother standing at the counter, holding those papers, realizing her entire reality wasn't what she thought. She confronted him. Margaret continued. What did he say? I asked. Margaret's expression hardened. He denied everything she said it was business-related, investments, loans. I let out a slow breath, and she didn't believe him. No, Margaret said, but she also didn't have proof of anything else. The room fell quiet until I asked the question that had been sitting heavy in my chest since I read the name. Who is Caroline Bishop? Margaret looked down at the table, then back at me. She was a real estate agent, she said. Worked in Dayton back then. She retired about 5 years ago, Margaret said softly. A chill ran down my spine. She's still alive, I repeated. Margaret nodded, and then she said something that made my stomach drop. She attended Richard's company events for years. I blinked. What? He didn't introduce her publicly, Margaret said, but she was always around. Charity dinners, holiday parties, community fundraisers. I felt something cold settle inside my chest. So while he was telling everyone my mother cheated, I said slowly, he was still involved with the woman he betrayed her, with Margaret finished. The hypocrisy of it made my hands shake. But what came next was worse. There's something else, Margaret said quietly. I looked up. What? She hesitated before answering. Caroline had a son. My pulse spiked. When? Born in 1995, she said. 1 year after me. The air left my lungs, because suddenly an awful possibility came into focus. Margaret, I whispered, are you saying? She always claimed the boy's father was a former boyfriend, Margaret said quickly. Richard never acknowledged him publicly, but he was sending her money the entire time, I said. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't have to. The implication hung in the air between us. Heavy, unavoidable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked quietly, did my mother know about the child? Margaret shook her head. No. That part came out years later. I leaned back in my chair, feeling like the floor had shifted beneath my entire understanding of the past. Because suddenly, Richard's behavior made even more sense. It wasn't just guilt. It wasn't just insecurity. It was projection. If he convinced the world I wasn't his, he never had to explain the possibility that another child might actually be. I stared down at the documents again. The dates, the signatures, the notarized confirmations. Every piece was legally valid, solid, undeniable. And yet my mother had never used them. Why didn't she fight him? I whispered. Margaret's eyes softened. Because she loved you, she said. I swallowed hard. She didn't want your childhood defined by courtrooms and scandals, Margaret continued. She believed protecting you meant staying quiet. A familiar ache spread through my chest, the kind that comes from understanding sacrifice. Too late. She trusted the truth would matter someday, Margaret added. I looked down at the DNA report again. The numbers, the certainty. 30 years of lies erased by a single line of science. So what do I do now? I asked quietly. Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked me a question. What do you want? I thought about it. Really thought. Did I want revenge? Money? Recognition? No, none of that felt right. What I wanted was something simpler. I want him to stop rewriting her, I said. Margaret nodded slowly. That's a boundary, she said. Not revenge. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But then another thought surfaced, one that made my pulse quicken. Does Evan know any of this? I asked. Margaret shook her head. No, she said. He grew up believing the same story everyone else did. I closed my eyes briefly, because that meant one thing. At the retirement gala, he was going to hear the truth at the exact same moment Richard did. In front of more than 100 witnesses, the weight of that reality settled heavily over me. This will destroy him, I whispered. Margaret's voice was gentle. No, she said. It will destroy the lie. There's a difference. I sat there quietly for a long moment, letting that sink in. Then I folded the documents carefully and placed them back in the envelope. My hands were steady now, more steady than they had been in years, because something inside me had shifted. For most of my life, I had carried silence like a burden. Now I realized silence was a choice, and I didn't owe it to him anymore. I looked at Margaret. I'm going to the gala, I said. She nodded once. I know, and I'm bringing this, I added, touching the envelope. Her eyes held mine. Then you need to prepare yourself, she said quietly. For what? For what happens when a man's entire identity collapses in public, she replied. The words sent a chill through me because deep down, I knew she was right. Richard Whitmore had spent 3 decades building his reputation on a carefully constructed narrative. A devoted husband, a successful businessman, a family man wronged by betrayal. If that story unraveled in front of his entire community, the fallout wouldn't just be emotional. It could be legal, financial, social, total. And for the first time, I realized something else. The retirement gala wasn't just an announcement. It was his final attempt to lock his version of history into place. But he had no idea that I was about to walk into that ballroom holding the one thing he could never control. The truth he'd spent 30 years trying to bury. On October 1st, 2025, exactly 10 days before the gala, I received an overnight envelope stamped with the logo of Whitmore Insurance Group. Inside was a single, cream-colored invitation card, black embossed lettering, formal, cold. Richard Whitmore requests the honor of your presence at his retirement and legacy gala, Saturday, October 11th, 7:00 p.m., Franklin Civic Center, Ballroom. At the bottom, in smaller font, was a handwritten note. You should hear this in person. R.W. No apology, no greeting, just a directive, like always. I stared at the card for a long time, feeling something strange settle inside my chest. Not anger, not fear, something steadier. Clarity? Because for the first time in my life, Richard Whitmore didn't have control over the outcome of a confrontation between us. I did. That night, I laid everything out on my dining table. The DNA report, the notarized timeline, the bank records, my mother's letter, 4 documents, 30 years of truth. I read them slowly, again and again, until every detail was etched into my memory. Because I knew something important. When the moment came, I wouldn't be able to rely on emotion. Only facts. And facts, when presented calmly, are far more powerful than anger. 3 days later, my brother Evan called. It was the first time we had spoken in nearly 6 years. I almost didn't answer, but I did. Lauren, he said, his voice tight, you got the invitation. Not a question, a statement. Yes, I replied. There was a long pause. I didn't know he sent one to you, Evan said quietly. I could hear something in his tone. Not hostility, unease. Did you know what he plans to say? I asked. Another pause. Yeah, he admitted. My chest tightened slightly. And you're okay with that? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded conflicted. It's not about being okay, he said. It's about, that's just how it's always been. Those words hit harder than I expected, because they revealed something deeper than loyalty. They revealed conditioning. Evan had grown up inside Richard's version of reality. For him, it wasn't cruelty. It was normal. Do you believe him? I asked quietly. The line went silent. For so long, I thought he might hang up. But then he said something that surprised me. I don't know what to believe anymore. His voice cracked slightly. I was a kid, Lauren. I just trusted what Dad said. A heavy silence followed. Then he asked something he'd never asked before. What really happened between you two? I closed my eyes briefly, because that question carried 20 years of unspoken history. I didn't do anything, I said calmly. And neither did Mom. He exhaled shakily. That's not what he told me. I know. Another pause. Then he said quietly, are you coming to the gala? Yes. The word hung between us, and I could almost hear his breathing change. Lauren, he said slowly, if you show up, things are going to explode. I didn't deny it. I know. What are you planning? He asked. I answered honestly. I'm bringing the truth. The line went completely silent, because in that moment, I think Evan realized something Richard hadn't yet considered. That this wasn't just a family conflict. It was a public reckoning. Dad doesn't think you'll come, Evan said finally. I let out a quiet breath. That's his first mistake. After we hung up, I sat in my living room for a long time. Because for the first time, I saw clearly what this situation truly was. It wasn't just about the past. It was about control. Richard needed to control the narrative, control how people saw him, control how history remembered him. And for decades, he had succeeded, because I had stayed silent. But silence only protects the person who benefits from it, not the person it hurts. A week before the gala, I received another unexpected call. This one from a number I didn't recognize. "Lauren Whitmore," a woman asked. "Yes, this is Caroline Bishop." The room seemed to tilt, because I hadn't contacted her. I hadn't even decided whether I would. "How did you get my number?" I asked carefully. "Your father gave it to me," she said quietly. My stomach dropped. What? "He told me you might reach out," she said. "He said you've been digging into the past." A cold realization settled over me. Richard knew, or at least suspected. "I haven't contacted you," I said evenly. "I know," she replied. "That's why I'm calling you." There was something in her voice. Not defensive, not hostile, something else. Weariness? "I think," she said slowly, "you deserve to know some things before Saturday." My pulse quickened. "What things?" A long silence. Then she said words that sent a chill straight down my spine. "Richard didn't just lie about you." The air seemed to leave the room. "What do you mean?" Her voice lowered. "He lied to everyone," she said, "including me." I felt my heart start pounding. What did he lie about? Another pause. And then she said the one thing I never expected to hear. "He told me he'd already divorced your mother." My breath caught. "He said you weren't his child." The room went completely still, because suddenly the entire story shifted again. Richard hadn't just rewritten history after the fact. He had been rewriting it in real time, to two different women. At the same time, Lauren Caroline said softly, "There's something else you need to know." My fingers tightened around the phone. "What?" Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "My son," she hesitated, "is not Richard's." The words hung in the air like something fragile and explosive all at once. Because that meant one thing. Richard had destroyed our family for a lie that wasn't even necessary. And suddenly, I understood something that made my chest go cold. The gala wasn't just about inheritance. It wasn't just about reputation. It was his final attempt to bury a truth that could dismantle everything he had built his life on. And now, I wasn't the only person who knew it. On October 4th, 2025, at exactly 7:41 p.m., I sat in my living room with my phone on speaker while Caroline Bishop told me the story Richard Whitmore had spent 30 years trying to erase. Her voice was calm, steady, but underneath it, I could hear something that sounded like exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a truth too long. "He approached me in 1993, she began, at a real estate networking event in Dayton. Said he was separated. Said his marriage had been over for years." I closed my eyes briefly, because the timeline matched perfectly. That was 6 months before I was born. "He was charming," she continued. "Confident. The kind of man who knew exactly what to say." Of course he was. That had always been Richard's greatest skill. He knew how to construct a version of himself that people wanted to believe in. "And you believed him?" I said quietly. "Yes," she replied. "For a long time." She paused before adding something that tightened my chest. "He told me your mother had cheated on him." I felt my fingers curl against my palm. "He said the baby she was carrying might not be his," Caroline said. "He told me he was preparing for divorce." The lie was so complete, so calculated. It wasn't just a defense mechanism. It was a strategy. "He even showed me documents," she said softly. My heart skipped. What kind of documents? "Copies of what he claimed were legal separation filings," she said. My stomach dropped. "Were they real?" "No," she answered quietly. I learned that years later. A long silence stretched between us. Then she said something that shifted everything again. By the time I realized the truth, I was already financially dependent on him. The pieces fell into place instantly. The bank transfers, the ongoing payments. He hadn't just been supporting her out of guilt. He had been maintaining control. He said, "If I ever contacted your mother," she continued, "he would cut me off completely." Her voice trembled slightly. I was a single mother by then. I was scared. I swallowed hard. "How long did it last?" I asked. "Almost 10 years," she said. 10 years. An entire decade of parallel lives. 2 women. 2 realities. Built on the same set of lies. "Why did it end?" I asked. Another pause. Then she answered quietly. "Because I found out about the DNA test." My heart stopped. "What?" "Yes," she said. "Your mother confronted him after the test confirmed you were his." I felt a cold clarity settle over me. So he had known with certainty. "From the beginning. He came to me furious," Caroline continued. "He said you were his daughter after all, and that everything was falling apart." Her voice hardened slightly. That was the moment I realized he'd been lying to both of us. The silence between us stretched heavy. "I left him within 6 months," she said. I exhaled slowly. "Then why did the payments continue?" I asked. "For my son's education," she said quietly. "He insisted." The words carried something complex. Not affection, not guilt, something closer to obligation. "He needed to keep me quiet," she added. There it was, the real reason. Because if she spoke publicly, the entire narrative he built about my mother would collapse, and so would his reputation. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. Caroline's voice softened. "Because he called me last week," she said. My chest tightened. What did he want? "He asked me to confirm his version of the past if anyone questioned it at the gala," she said. I felt a cold anger rise in my chest. Even now, even after all these years, he was still trying to control the story. "He offered money," she continued quietly. "How much?" I asked. $50,000, she said. The number landed heavily, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. He was trying to buy silence. Again. "What did you say?" I asked. There was a brief pause. Then she said something that made my throat tighten. I told him no. The word hung in the air, like something clean and final. "I spent years letting him control the narrative," she said softly. "I'm not doing it anymore." A long silence followed. Then she asked quietly, "Are you planning to speak at the gala?" "Yes," I said. "What will you say?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "Only the truth." She exhaled slowly. "Then you should know something else," she said. My pulse quickened. "What?" "He's terrified," she whispered. I blinked. "Of what?" "Of losing everything he built his identity around," she said. "His reputation, his legacy, his image." Her voice lowered. "He doesn't fear financial loss. He fears humiliation." The words settled into me with quiet weight. Because suddenly, I understood something important. This wasn't just about money, or inheritance, or even family. For Richard, this was about control over how the world saw him. And public exposure was the one thing he couldn't manipulate. Lauren Caroline said gently, "There's one more thing you need to prepare for." My heart thudded. "What?" "He will deny everything," she said, even when confronted with proof. I let out a slow breath. "I know. Then you need to stay calm," she added. "Because the moment you lose emotional control, he will use it to discredit you." Her words landed like a quiet warning. And she was right. This wasn't going to be a private conversation. It would be a public confrontation in front of more than 100 witnesses, where every reaction would be judged, analyzed, remembered. "I won't lose control," I said quietly. Another silence. Then Caroline asked something unexpected. "Lauren, can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why now?" she asked softly. "Why not let the past stay buried?" I thought about it carefully before answering. Because the truth was simple. "I'm not doing this for revenge," I said. "I'm doing it to protect my mother's name." The line went quiet. Then she whispered, "She would be proud of you." Those words hit deeper than anything else she'd said. Because for years, I had wondered what my mother would think of the person I'd become. Now for the first time, I felt like I knew. After we hung up, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the envelope on my coffee table. 30 years of silence, one night away from ending. But as I reached for it, another realization settled heavily over me. The gala wouldn't just expose Richard's lies. It would also expose something else, something he had been hiding even more carefully. Because buried inside the financial records, there was one detail I hadn't fully processed yet. One line item, a transfer made 18 years ago, not to Caroline, but to a law firm, for a service labeled in cold, precise legal language, paternity dispute contingency preparation. And suddenly, I understood something chilling. Richard hadn't just lied about me after I was born. He had been preparing to deny me before I even existed. On October 8th, 2025, exactly 3 days before the gala, I stopped talking about Richard Whitmore completely. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because silence, when chosen intentionally, is a form of power. For years, my silence had been forced on me. Now, it was deliberate. I didn't discuss the documents with coworkers. I didn't respond to 2 voicemails from Richard's attorney. I didn't answer Evan's text messages asking, "Are you okay?" Instead, I did something that looked ordinary from the outside. I kept living my life. I went to work at the urban planning firm, where I had spent the past 7 years building a career. I reviewed zoning applications, led a budget meeting, and signed off on a housing development proposal scheduled for 2026. On the surface, everything was normal. Inside, everything was shifting. Because the truth has a strange effect on you once you fully accept it. It doesn't make you louder. It makes you calmer, more precise, more certain. That Wednesday evening, I drove to my Aunt Margaret's house one last time before the gala. We sat in the same kitchen where I had opened my mother's envelope weeks earlier. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The quiet between us wasn't tense. It felt like the stillness before a storm you already know is coming. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. "Are you afraid?" she asked, gently. I considered the question carefully. Then I answered honestly, "No." She studied my face. "Not even a little." I shook my head slowly. "I was afraid for 20 years, I said. "I don't have anything left to be afraid of." She nodded once. "That's what I thought." Another silence settled. Then she said something unexpected. "You know," she said quietly, "this isn't going to end the way you think it will." I looked up. "What do you mean?" Margaret's expression was calm but serious. "When a man like Richard loses control publicly," she said, "he doesn't collapse immediately. He fights first." The words landed heavily because I knew she was right. Richard had built his entire identity on dominance and perception. He wouldn't surrender easily. "How will he fight?" I asked. Margaret met my eyes. "He'll try to make you look unstable," she said. "Emotional, vindictive." I nodded slowly. "That's why you must stay completely calm," she added, "no matter what he says." I thought about Caroline's warning, the same message from 2 different people. That alone told me how predictable Richard's behavior would be. "He'll deny the documents," Margaret continued. "He'll question their authenticity. He'll say you manipulated them." I took a slow breath. "I know." She studied me carefully. "Then, there's one more thing you need to understand." "What?" Her voice softened. "This isn't just about him." I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "It's about Evan," she said. The name settled heavily between us. "Saturday will change his life too," she continued, "in ways he hasn't prepared for." I looked down at the table because that was the part of this situation that still hurt. "I never wanted to hurt him," I said quietly. "I know," Margaret replied, "but he's going to be hurt anyway." Her words were gentle, but they were true, and truth I had learned isn't always comfortable. It's just necessary. That night before I left, Margaret handed me something small, a folded photograph. I opened it carefully. It was a picture of my mother holding me as a baby. She was smiling, but what struck me most was her expression. Not just happiness, strength, a quiet, steady strength. "She kept this in her wallet," Margaret said softly, "until the day she died." My throat tightened. She believed, Margaret continued, that one day you would understand why she stayed silent. I traced the edge of the photo with my finger. "I understand now," I whispered. Margaret nodded. And she would want you to remember something else. What? That telling the truth doesn't make you cruel, she said. It makes you free. I held the photo for a long moment. Then I slipped it carefully into the envelope with the documents. Because I knew something with absolute certainty. I wasn't walking into that ballroom alone. I was carrying my mother's voice with me. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30 a.m. without an alarm. The sky outside my apartment window was still dark. For a moment, I lay there quietly, listening to the steady rhythm of my breathing. Calm, even, not the racing anxiety I might have expected. Instead, I felt something else, a strange sense of inevitability, like a chapter of my life was about to close, and there was nothing left to question. Later that day, something happened that confirmed Margaret's warning. At 3:17 p.m., my office receptionist buzzed my desk. "Lauren," she said hesitantly, "there's someone here asking for you." "Who?" She paused. "Richard Whitmore." For a moment, the entire world seemed to go silent. He had never come to my workplace before, not once, in my entire life. And now, 3 days before the gala, he was standing in the lobby, unannounced, uninvited. I walked downstairs slowly, and when I stepped into the reception area, I saw him immediately. He looked older than I remembered, grayer, thinner, but his posture was still rigid, controlled, like a man trying to hold onto authority that was slipping through his fingers. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said the first words he had spoken to me in 11 years. "You shouldn't come on Saturday." His voice was calm, but beneath it, I could hear something unfamiliar. Fear. I held his gaze steadily. "Why?" I asked. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because you don't understand what you're about to destroy." The words hung between us. I didn't respond immediately, because I realized something important in that moment. He wasn't apologizing. He wasn't seeking reconciliation. He was trying to maintain control. "One last time." "I understand perfectly," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "You think those papers will change anything?" he said. "They won't." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply said the one thing he had never expected to hear from me. "This isn't about changing anything. It's about ending the lie." For the first time in my life, I saw Richard Whitmore hesitate. Just slightly, but enough. He searched my face as if trying to find uncertainty. He didn't, because there wasn't any left. Finally, he said something that confirmed everything I already knew. "If you do this," he whispered, "you'll regret it." I met his eyes calmly. "No," I said. "You will." He stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the building without another word. I watched him leave, and as the glass doors closed behind him, a quiet certainty settled inside me. The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was already here, and in 3 days, it would finally break. On October 10th, 2025, at exactly 8:03 p.m., I laid out my clothes for the gala on my bed and realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. For weeks, I had expected anxiety, restlessness, second thoughts, but instead, what I felt was something far quieter. Resolve. The dress I chose wasn't dramatic. It was a simple navy sheath, professional, understated, the kind of thing you could wear to a board meeting or a formal dinner without drawing attention. Because that was the point. I didn't need to look powerful. I needed to be calm. On the nightstand, beside the bed, sat the envelope. Cream-colored, worn at the edges. Inside it were 4 documents that could dismantle 30 years of carefully constructed lies. Next to it, I placed my mother's photograph, the last thing I would see before leaving the apartment. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. No racing thoughts, no dreams, just stillness. The next morning, October 11th, began like any other Saturday. I woke at 6:15 a.m., brewed coffee, and sat by my living room window, watching the sunrise paint the sky pale gold over the city. It struck me then how ordinary everything looked, how quiet, How normal. And yet by the end of that day, nothing about my life or Richard's would be the same. At 9:40 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Evan. Are you really coming tonight? I stared at the screen for a long moment before responding. Yes. The typing dots appeared immediately. Please don't do this, he wrote. The words hit harder than I expected because they weren't defensive. They were pleading. I typed back carefully. I'm not trying to hurt you. Several seconds passed. Then he replied, You don't understand what this will do to him. I read the message twice. Then I responded with the only truth that mattered. I understand exactly what it will do. Another pause. Then one final message from him. I wish things had been different between us. My chest tightened slightly. Me too, I typed. He didn't respond after that. At noon, my Aunt Margaret called. Are you ready? She asked. Yes, I said. There was a long pause on her end. I want you to remember something, she said softly. What? No matter what happens tonight, you don't owe anyone an explanation beyond the truth. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I know. And Lauren, she added gently, you don't have to stay once you've said what you need to say. Her words settled into me like a quiet anchor. Because she was right. This wasn't about winning an argument. It was about reclaiming a narrative. Once that was done, I could walk away. At 3:12 p.m., I received one final call before leaving. This one from Caroline Bishop. I wanted to wish you strength, she said quietly. Thank you. She hesitated. I won't be there tonight, she added. But I told Richard yesterday that if he lies publicly again, I will confirm the truth myself. Her words sent a steady warmth through me. You don't have to do that, I said. I know, she replied. But I should have done it years ago. A brief silence followed. Then she said something that stayed with me. Truth has a way of finding daylight eventually, even if it takes decades. At 6:05 p.m., I left my apartment. The envelope rested inside my handbag. My mother's photograph was tucked inside it. As I locked the door behind me, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not nerves, not fear, closure. Because no matter what happened that night, one chapter of my life was ending. The Franklin Civic Center ballroom was already buzzing when I arrived at 6:52 p.m. Valet attendants directed cars. Guests in formal attire gathered near the entrance. Inside, soft jazz music floated through the air. Round tables draped in white linen filled the room. Crystal glasses caught the warm light from chandeliers overhead. A large stage stood at the front, where a podium and microphone had been set up. Behind it hung a massive banner. Congratulations, Richard Whitmore, celebrating 40 years of leadership. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment, taking it all in. More than 100 people filled the space. Business partners, community leaders, extended family members, everyone smiling, laughing, unaware that the foundation of the man they were honoring was about to fracture. A hostess approached me. Name, please. Lauren Whitmore, I said calmly. She froze slightly, then checked her list. Yes, you're expected, she said. Of course I was. Richard wanted witnesses. I accepted a glass of water and moved toward a table near the back of the room. From there I could see everything. The stage, the podium, the entrance. At 7:18 p.m., Evan entered the ballroom. He looked tense. His eyes scanned the room until they found mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he walked over slowly. Lauren, he said quietly. Hi, I replied. We stood facing each other, the weight of years between us. You don't have to do this, he said again. His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. I met his eyes steadily. Yes, I do. A long silence passed. Then he whispered something that made my chest ache. I wish Dad had just told the truth years ago. I nodded. So do I. At 7:32 p.m., the music faded. A spotlight illuminated the stage. Richard Whitmore stepped up to the podium. The room erupted into applause. He looked confident, polished. Every inch the respected community leader he had spent decades presenting to the world. He began his speech with practiced ease, thanking colleagues, recalling milestones, celebrating his company's growth from a two-person startup to a regional firm valued at over $18 million. Then he spoke about legacy, about family, about the importance of bloodlines. The words felt deliberate, calculated. And then, at exactly 7:46 p.m., he said the sentence he had rehearsed for years. "Tonight, I want to make something official." The room grew quiet. "My life's work," he continued, "will pass entirely to my son, Evan Whitmore, my only child." A ripple moved through the audience. Some clapped politely, others glanced around uncertainly, because many of them knew. They knew he had another daughter. They knew I was in the room. Richard paused deliberately. Then he looked directly toward the back of the ballroom. "Toward me. And I want to clarify something publicly," he said. His voice was calm, confident, rehearsed. "Lauren Whitmore is not and has never been my biological daughter." The words hung in the air like a sharp crack. Silence followed, heavy, complete. More than 100 people held their breath. I sat perfectly still for 3 seconds. Then I stood and reached into my bag for the envelope. At exactly 7:47 p.m., I stood up from my chair while more than 100 people watched in complete silence. You could hear the faint hum of the ballroom air conditioning, the clink of someone setting down a glass. Nothing else, because everyone understood instinctively that something irreversible was about to happen. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked toward the stage at a steady pace, the envelope held calmly in my hand. Richard watched me approach. For the first time since I had entered the room, I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, not arrogance, fear. When I reached the front, I stopped about 6 feet from the podium. "May I have 1 minute?" I asked. My voice was clear, measured, professional, the way I spoke in public hearings or planning board meetings. Because this wasn't a family argument. This was a presentation of facts. Richard didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened. "You've said enough already," he replied sharply. I didn't react. I simply said one sentence. "You've had 30 years to tell your version." A quiet ripple moved through the audience. "I'm asking for 60 seconds to present mine." The room went still again, because the contrast between our tones was unmistakable. He sounded defensive. I sounded calm. And calm in moments like this carries enormous authority. Richard hesitated. Then, likely calculating that refusing would make him look guilty, he gestured stiffly toward the microphone. 60 seconds, he said coldly. I stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and looked out at the audience. For a brief moment, I saw faces I recognized from childhood. Neighbors, old family friends, former employees of his company, people who had believed his narrative for decades. I took a slow breath. "My name is Lauren Whitmore," I began. "My mother was Teresa Collins Whitmore." A few people nodded. Her name still carried respect in the community. "For 30 years," I continued calmly, "there has been a public claim that she was unfaithful in her marriage." The room grew even quieter. "I am here tonight to correct that claim with documented evidence." I opened the envelope slowly, every movement deliberate, controlled, because presentation matters, especially when truth is competing with decades of misinformation. I held up the first document, a lab-certified report. "This," I said clearly, "is a DNA paternity test conducted on March 17, 1994. I paused, letting the date settle. Before I was even 1 year old. It was performed by Dayton Medical Genetics Laboratory. I turned the page outward so the audience could see the official seal. The probability of paternity is 99.997%. Then I said the line that shattered the narrative Richard had built for decades. "Richard Allen Whitmore is my biological father." A wave of murmurs moved through the ballroom. Not loud, but unmistakable. Shock, disbelief, recalculation. Richard's face drained of color. "That's fabricated," he said immediately. His voice was louder now, sharpened. "She's falsified documents." I didn't react. Instead, I calmly placed the DNA report on the podium. Then, I held up the second document. This, I continued evenly, is a notarized statement signed by my mother in 1994. I read directly from it. Quote, "This test was conducted to address my husband's doubts. It confirms without question that he is the biological father of our child." A collective stillness fell over the room. Because a notarized statement is legally binding, and everyone knew it, Richard's breathing had become visibly uneven. "She forced that test," he snapped. "She manipulated the situation." I didn't argue. I didn't respond emotionally. I simply moved to the third document. "This," I said, "is a financial record timeline." I held it steady. Between October 1993 and 2003, Richard Whitmore transferred over $183,000 to another woman. A ripple of gasps moved through the audience, because this wasn't rumor. It was documented fact. I read the name aloud. Caroline Bishop. A few people in the crowd visibly reacted. Some recognized it. Some whispered. Richard's hands tightened on the podium. "This is irrelevant," he said sharply. It has everything to do with it," I said calmly. "Because it explains why he needed to rewrite the narrative." The room fell silent again. Then I delivered the final piece, the one that changed everything. "The fourth document," I said quietly, "is a legal record dated 1993. I looked directly at Richard. "It shows that you consulted a law firm regarding a paternity denial contingency before I was even born." The words landed like a shockwave, because they revealed something far deeper than denial. Premeditation, intent, a deliberate plan. A man in the front row whispered, "My God!" Richard's face had gone completely pale, his composure fractured. "That's a lie," he said hoarsely. "You're twisting everything." I held his gaze steadily. "No," I said quietly. "I'm ending it." Silence flooded the ballroom, heavy, absolute. Then from somewhere near the back of the room, a woman stood. Caroline Bishop. I hadn't known she would come, neither had Richard. Her voice carried clearly across the room. "She's telling the truth." Every head turned. "I was there," Caroline said steadily. "He told me his wife cheated. He told me the child wasn't his." Her eyes moved to Richard. "You lied to both of us." The final thread of his narrative snapped in that moment, because now it wasn't just my word or documents. It was corroboration, a living witness. Richard's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came, because there were none left that could save him. On the stage, the silence felt almost physical, like pressure in the air. And in that silence, I said the final sentence I had carried inside me for 30 years. "My mother was faithful. Your story was not." Then I stepped away from the microphone and walked off the stage, leaving the truth behind me, where everyone could see it. At exactly 7:56 p.m., the ballroom fell into a silence, so complete you could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. No one clapped, no one moved, because applause belongs to celebrations. And this was not a celebration anymore. It was an unraveling. I had just stepped down from the stage when the first reaction came not from the audience, but from Richard. "This is a smear campaign." His voice cut sharply through the stillness. He gripped the podium with both hands, knuckles white, trying to reclaim authority. "She's manipulating old records," he said loudly. "Half-truths taken out of context." It was exactly what Margaret had predicted. Denial, then reframing. He looked out at the audience, searching for allies. "I built this company from nothing." He continued, his tone shifting toward indignation. "I devoted my life to this community." He pointed toward me. "And now she shows up after 11 years to destroy everything." The words were calculated, not to prove innocence, but to trigger sympathy, to reposition himself as the victim. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke in agreement, because the documents still sat on the podium, visible, undeniable. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't react. I simply stood quietly, near the edge of the stage, hands folded in front of me. And that calmness did something powerful. It made his rising agitation look even more unstable. "Where were you all these years?" he demanded, his voice tightening. "You never wanted a relationship." There it was. Stage 2. Blame shifting. I answered calmly. "You asked me to leave when I was 19. A murmur rippled through the room, because that detail, spoken simply, without drama, carried more weight than any accusation. Richard's jaw clenched. "You misunderstood that situation," he snapped. "I didn't misunderstand a $100 bill in a 15-minute deadline," I replied evenly. A visible reaction moved through the audience. Some people exchanged shocked looks. Others stared at Richard with new awareness. Because cruelty, once described plainly, is hard to excuse. He faltered for a moment, then moved to stage 3, victim positioning. "I did what I had to do," he said, voice trembling slightly now. "I was trying to protect my family from instability." The word instability hung in the air, an obvious attempt to paint me as the source of chaos. But it didn't land, because he was no longer speaking from authority. He was defending, explaining, trying, and everyone in that room could see it. Then, Evan stood up. He hadn't spoken yet. He had remained seated near the front, pale and silent as the truth unfolded. Now he stepped forward slowly. "Dad," he said quietly. Richard turned toward him with visible relief, because for a brief moment he thought support had arrived. "You know this isn't true," Richard said quickly. "You know how she's always twisted things." Evan didn't answer immediately. He walked to the podium, picked up the DNA report, read it silently. Then he looked at his father. "Is it real?" he asked. The question was simple, direct, impossible to evade. Richard hesitated, just long enough for everyone to notice. "That's not the point," he said finally. And in that moment, his answer became a confession. Because when someone refuses to deny something clearly, people understand why. Evan's face tightened. "You told me my entire life she wasn't your daughter," he said quietly. No one in the ballroom moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Richard opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I was trying to protect you," he said weakly. That was the moment everything collapsed, because Evan's voice broke slightly as he responded. "From what?" The question echoed through the room. Richard had no answer, because there was none, and silence in that moment said everything. Evan placed the DNA report back on the podium. Then he stepped back, not dramatically, not angrily, just distantly, like someone who had suddenly realized the ground beneath them wasn't solid after all. Richard watched him, eyes wide. The shift in power was unmistakable. He had lost his audience. He had lost control of the narrative. And now he was losing the one person he had built his entire legacy around. Desperation replaced composure. "You don't understand," Richard said, voice rising. "Everything I did was for this family." His hand struck the podium. The sharp sound echoed across the ballroom, but instead of authority, it sounded hollow, because no one believed it anymore. Marcus Whitmore, Richard's younger brother, stood up from the second row. He had remained silent all evening. Now his voice was steady. "Teresa was the most loyal person I ever knew." The words landed like quiet judgment. "You let people believe she betrayed you," Marcus continued. "You let her reputation suffer for decades." Richard stared at him in disbelief. "You're taking her side," he demanded. Marcus didn't raise his voice. "I'm taking the side of the truth." The room remained silent, but the silence had changed. It was no longer tense. It was final, like a verdict already reached. Richard's shoulders sagged slightly. For the first time that night, he looked smaller, older, not powerful, just tired. He looked around the ballroom at colleagues, relatives, employees. Faces that once reflected admiration now showed something else. Distance, disappointment, disillusionment. The applause he had expected was gone. In its place was a quiet, collective withdrawal, and that more than any argument broke him. He stepped back from the podium slowly. No more speeches, no more denials, no more attempts to control the narrative. because there was nothing left to control. And in that moment, I realized something important. The truth hadn't destroyed him. His own choices had. The truth had simply exposed them. I picked up my bag because my part in this was finished. As I turned toward the exit, I heard Evan's voice behind me. "Lauren," I stopped, but didn't turn immediately because I knew that whatever he said next would be the beginning of a different kind of ending. At exactly 8:03 p.m., I stopped walking when I heard Evan say my name. Not loudly, not urgently, just quietly, like someone calling out to a person they suddenly realized they might lose forever. I turned slowly. He was standing a few feet away from the stage now, his hands hanging at his sides, his face pale and drawn in a way I had never seen before. For most of his life, Evan had been the center of Richard's world, the golden child, the heir, the proof that his legacy would continue exactly as he imagined. Now, in the span of less than 20 minutes, that entire identity had fractured. "Can we talk?" Evan asked. His voice wasn't defensive anymore. It wasn't pleading either. It sounded uncertain. I nodded once. We stepped toward a quiet corner near the ballroom entrance, away from the stage, where guests were still sitting in stunned silence. For a moment, neither of us spoke, because there are conversations that don't start with words. They start with the collapse of old assumptions. Finally, Evan exhaled slowly. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted. I understood that feeling, so I helped him. "Start with what you're thinking right now," I said calmly. He ran a hand through his hair, eyes unfocused. "I'm thinking that everything I believed about our family might have been wrong." The sentence hung heavily between us, because it wasn't just about Richard. It was about his entire childhood, his identity, his sense of reality. "That's a hard thing to face," I said quietly. He nodded. Then he looked at me directly. "Did you hate me all these years?" The question caught me off guard, because it revealed something I hadn't fully considered. Evan had grown up believing I disappeared because I didn't care, because I rejected the family. He had never known the truth. "No," I said gently. "I never hated you." His shoulders lowered slightly, as if releasing tension he had carried for years. "I always thought you just left," he said. "I didn't understand why you never tried to come back." I met his eyes steadily, because I wasn't allowed to. The words were simple, but they landed with quiet force. He swallowed hard. "Dad told me you chose to cut us off." I nodded. "I know." A long silence followed. Then Evan asked something else. "Did you ever want to fix things between us?" The question carried real vulnerability. I answered honestly. "Yes," I said, "but you were a kid, and I knew you believed what you were told." His eyes filled slightly. "I wish I had asked more questions back then," he whispered. "That wasn't your responsibility," I said gently. "It was his." We both glanced toward the stage. Richard was still standing there, surrounded by a few hesitant guests, his posture rigid but deflated. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of admiration. He was the center of scrutiny. Evan followed my gaze. "I don't know what happens now," he said quietly. I understood what he meant, because the fallout wouldn't end tonight. It would ripple through every aspect of his life. His relationship with his father, his role in the company, his sense of identity. "You get to decide what happens now," I said. He looked at me. "What do you mean?" "You decide what kind of man you want to be," I said calmly. "Not based on his expectations, based on your own values." He absorbed that slowly. Then he asked something that surprised me. "Is there any chance we can have a relationship now?" The question was tentative, careful, like someone afraid of being rejected. I thought about it for a moment, not because I doubted the answer, because I wanted to be honest. "Yes," I said finally, "but it will have to be a new relationship." He nodded quickly. "I understand. No pretending the past didn't happen," I added gently. "No rewriting history, just honesty." He met my eyes. "That's all I want too." For the first time in years, something inside my chest softened. Not forgiveness for Richard. That was a separate issue entirely. But something else. Relief. Because I realized I hadn't lost my brother forever. He had just been trapped inside a story that wasn't true. And now, for the first time, he was free to see beyond it. "I'm glad you came tonight," he said quietly. I held his gaze. "So am I." A few seconds passed. Then he asked one last question. "Are you leaving now?" "Yes," I said. "My part here is finished." He nodded slowly. "I understand." Then he hesitated, before saying something that mattered more than he probably realized. "I'm sorry, Lauren." The words were simple, but they carried years of silence, years of misunderstanding, years of distance, and they were genuine. I gave a small nod. "Thank you." No dramatic embrace, no emotional scene, just quiet acknowledgement. Because healing doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks exactly like that moment. Two people standing calmly in a crowded room, choosing honesty over denial. As I turned toward the exit, again I heard raised voices near the stage. Richard was arguing with one of his senior business partners. "The board needs to review this situation," the man was saying. "Reputation matters." Another voice added quietly. "There could be legal exposure if false statements were made publicly." I didn't stop walking, because I already knew what would happen next. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Contracts would be reconsidered. Partnerships would be reevaluated. Trust would erode, because reputation, once fractured, doesn't collapse instantly. It dissolves slowly, and there was nothing left for me to do there. I pushed open the ballroom doors at exactly 8:21 p.m. and stepped into the cool night air. For a moment, I just stood on the sidewalk, breathing, feeling something unfamiliar settle inside me. Not anger, not triumph, peace. Because the story that had defined me for decades was finally over, and the silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was freeing. On the morning of November 2nd, 2025, 22 days after the gala, I sat at my kitchen table at exactly 7:06 a.m., watching sunlight spill across the hardwood floor while my coffee cooled untouched in front of me. It was the first completely quiet morning I'd had in years. Not quiet in the sense of absence, quiet in the sense of peace. Because for most of my life, silence had meant tension, waiting, unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Now, for the first time, it felt different. It felt like space. Space to breathe, space to exist without defending myself, space to simply be. 3 weeks had passed since the night everything unraveled at the Franklin Civic Center. The fallout had come exactly the way Margaret predicted, not as a single explosion, but as a steady, irreversible collapse. Within 5 days of the gala, Whitmore Insurance Group's board announced an internal review of leadership conduct. 2 senior partners resigned quietly. A regional contract worth nearly $3.2 million was withdrawn. Not because of financial mismanagement, because of reputational risk. In corporate environments, perception matters almost as much as performance, and Richard's carefully cultivated image had fractured publicly. Once trust cracks, it rarely reforms. He didn't lose everything overnight, but he lost something far more significant: authority, respect, credibility. I didn't follow every detail. I didn't need to, because the outcome no longer defined my life. That was the real shift. For years, Richard's narrative had shaped how others saw me. Now his consequences existed entirely separate from me, as they should have all along. Evan and I began talking regularly. At first, the conversations were awkward, careful, like 2 people learning a language they should have known years ago. But slowly, something genuine formed, not based on shared history, based on shared truth. One afternoon, he came to my apartment for the first time in his life. He stood in the doorway, looking slightly uncertain, holding a small plant in a ceramic pot. "I wasn't sure what to bring," he said sheepishly. I smiled. "This is perfect." He set it on my windowsill, where it caught the afternoon light. For a moment, we both stood there quietly. Then he said something that mattered more than any apology. "I don't want to repeat his patterns." The words were simple, but they carried intention. "I know," I said. And I believed him. Because unlike Richard, Evan was willing to question himself, willing to admit uncertainty, willing to rebuild. That alone made all the difference. As for Richard, I heard about him occasionally, through mutual contacts. He remained in his house on Willow Creek Drive, but he rarely appeared at community events anymore. When he did, conversations around him shifted quickly. Not hostile, just distant, polite, controlled. Because once someone is exposed as unreliable in truth, people instinctively create space. No public confrontation followed. No dramatic reconciliation attempts. He sent one letter. Short, formal. It contained a single line that stood out. I never intended for things to go this far. Not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a statement of regret about consequences. I read it once, then placed it in a drawer and closed it, because I understood something clearly by then. Closure doesn't require mutual understanding. It requires personal acceptance, and I had already reached that point. One Saturday morning in late November, I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried. It had been years since my last visit. Not because I had forgotten her, because I hadn't felt ready. But that morning felt different. The air was crisp, the sky clear and pale blue. I brought a small bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flowers, and the photograph Margaret had given me. I stood beside the headstone for a long time without speaking, because sometimes words aren't necessary. Presence is enough. Finally, I said quietly, "They know the truth now." The breeze moved gently through the trees. For the first time in my life, the memory of her didn't feel heavy with unresolved pain. It felt calm, complete, because the one thing she had protected all those years, her integrity, had finally been restored. And that mattered more than anything else. Before I left, I added something else, something I hadn't fully realized until that moment. "I'm okay now." The words felt simple, but they were profound, because for most of my life, I hadn't been okay. I had been surviving, adapting, enduring. Now I was living. The difference was quiet, but unmistakable. That night, back in my apartment, I framed two things and hung them side by side on the wall above my desk. On the left was the photograph of my mother holding me as a baby. On the right was the $100 bill Richard had thrown at me 12 years earlier. Not as a symbol of anger, as a reminder of where my story began and how far I had come since. Because that bill once represented rejection. Now it represented resilience, proof that someone's attempt to define your worth doesn't determine your value. You do. If you're listening to this story right now, I want to ask you something. Have you ever carried a narrative about yourself that wasn't true? Something someone else imposed on you? Something you believed for years because it came from someone with authority in your life? If you have, here's what I learned. Truth doesn't always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes years, sometimes decades. But when it does arrive, it doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself. And that's where real freedom begins. Revenge, despite what we're often told, isn't loud. It isn't explosive. The most powerful form of justice is quiet. It's living well, setting boundaries, and refusing to carry someone else's lies any longer. That's what finally freed me. My name is Lauren Whitmore. I am 31 years old. I am an urban planner, a sister, and the daughter of a woman who never betrayed anyone. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe, and share where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever had to set a boundary to protect your peace, tell me what it was. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply tell the truth and then walk away.